From Lausanne to Montreux, the rebirth of the Mediterranean Turk. Gürdeniz.
Lausanne and Montreux are not two independent diplomatic achievements, but two historic stages that complement one another in the Turkish state's struggle for sovereignty. The Treaty of Lausanne, signed on July 24, 1923, is the foundational international document that established the Republic. It is the diplomatic recognition of the life-and-death struggle won by the Anatolian Turks, whom others had sought to leave without a state or a nation, and a document of honor written in blood. Borders drawn in blood at Lausanne. Lausanne was not a negotiation conducted merely around a table. It was the recognition in international law of the military and political reality created by the Great Offensive and the Armistice of Mudanya. The borders established by the treaty largely reflected the operational lines actually reached by the Turkish army in 1923. In other words, the borders drawn at Lausanne came not from the negotiating table, but from the battlefield. They were drawn in blood. The War of Independence was fought on land, while its ammunition was brought by sea from Russia across the Black Sea. From 1920 onward, the national forces first secured the eastern borders. In the autumn of 1922, following Mustafa Kemal's directive to his armies to advance towards the Mediterranean, the Turkish army reached Izmir, and eastern Thrace was recovered without fighting by the end of 1922. Liberation from the scourge of the capitulations. The value of Lausanne cannot be measured solely by the borders it established. One of the treaty's greatest achievements was the definitive abolition of the capitulations, which had eroded the economic sovereignty of the Ottoman Empire for centuries. Ending these privileges, which had opened Ottoman public finances, the judiciary, trade, and customs policy to the influence of foreign powers, laid the foundation for the economic independence of the Republic of Turkey.
Ataturk and the Lausanne delegation, knowing that political independence could be completed only through economic sovereignty, made no concessions on this matter. In this respect, Lausanne was not merely a border treaty, but the founding document of the national economy, the national legal order, and the principle of a fully independent state. The abolition of the capitulations also restored cabotage rights and sovereignty at sea, thereby restarting, after a long interruption, the process through which the Mediterranean Turk became a maritime people. The Treaty of Lausanne and Maritime Geopolitics. Although liberation from the capitulations through Lausanne was a major gain for the Blue Homeland, two fundamental Blue Homeland issues remained unresolved from the perspective of Turkey's maritime geopolitics in 1923. The first was the Turkish Straits. Under the convention relating to the regime of the Straits annexed to the treaty, Turkey was unable to establish full military sovereignty over the Straits. The area was demilitarized, and administration of the Straits was placed under the supervision of an international commission. The second issue was the Aegean Islands immediately off the coast of Anatolia. The military success achieved on the land front during the national struggle could not be converted into a strategic gain of equal magnitude in maritime geopolitics. This was due not to any diplomatic inadequacy on the part of the Lausanne delegation, but to the military balance of power that emerged at the end of the war, Turkey's naval capabilities at the time, and the international environment, all of which restricted the scope of negotiations. Consequently, because Turkey lacked a Megi, the Treaty of Lausanne could secure only limited sovereignty over the Turkish Straits.
Cyprus, which had been under British occupation since 1878, was ceded to Britain under Article 20, while the Menteşe Islands, the Dodecanese, lying adjacent to the Turkish coast, were transferred to Italian sovereignty under Article 15. Under Article 12, Gökçeada, Bozcaada, and the Topşan Islands remained with Turkey, while Greek sovereignty over Lesbos, Chios, Samos, Ikaria, Lemnos, and Samothrace was confirmed. Under Article 13, Lesbos, Chios, Samos, and Ikaria were prohibited from being converted into naval bases or fortified, and only limited security forces were permitted on the islands. Lemnos and Samothrace, meanwhile, were demilitarized as part of the security arrangement for the Straits established by the Straits Convention signed at Lausanne. However, today, those under demilitarized and non-militarized status, the maritime legacy of an Ottoman Empire without a navy. The main reason full sovereignty over the Turkish Straits was not left to Turkey at Lausanne was not legal, but rather related to the balance of power and the security perceptions of the period. The Allied powers, especially Britain, believed that a Turkey without a navy could not defend the Straits on its own. They therefore insisted that the Straits be demilitarized, that the passage regime be placed under international guarantees, and that it be supervised by an International Straits Commission. Behind this approach lay the military situation inherited from the Ottoman Empire. By 1918, the Ottoman Navy had effectively been put out of action. The fleet inherited by the Republic in October 1923 contained no major warship ready for operations.
The battlecruiser Yavuz was immobilized, naval doctrine and the training system had collapsed, and because Istanbul had been demilitarized, dockyard and base infrastructure could not be used effectively.
Under these conditions, the Ankara government's priorities were recognition of the land borders of the National Pact, abolition of the capitulations, and international recognition of independence. A demand for full sovereignty over the Straits was therefore not regarded as sustainable within the military and diplomatic realities of the period. The same absence of a navy was also one of the most important factors determining the status of the Aegean Islands at Lausanne. The islands, which had been under Ottoman rule from the 15th century onward, had been lost first during the Greek War of Independence and later during the Italo-Turkish and Balkan Wars. Although the Turkish army had won a decisive victory in Anatolia, it did not possess the naval power required to carry that victory into the Aegean Sea. Thus, while the frontiers reached by the land campaign were recognized in international law, the status quo of 1913-1914 was largely preserved in maritime geopolitics. In other words, the decisive factor in the fate of the Aegean Islands was not diplomatic ability, but the balance of naval power. The presence of a strong navy capable of conducting operations could have produced a different negotiating framework, although it is not historically possible to claim that this would necessarily have resulted in the islands being ceded to Turkey. Nevertheless, the Lausanne delegation was fully aware of the strategic importance of the islands lying very close to the Anatolian coast. The clearest example is the debate over Mace, or Castellarizo. At the Lausanne session of 4 June 1923, İsmet İnönü argued that Mace lay only 2 kilometers from the Anatolian coast, that geographically it should be regarded as a natural extension of Anatolia, and that its attachment to Turkey was essential for the tranquility and military security of Asia Minor. He based his claim not on ethnic grounds but entirely on geopolitical and military security considerations.
The Allied powers, led by Britain, rejected this position and insisted that the island remain under Italian control. İnönü then withdrew the claim in order not to endanger the Treaty of Lausanne as a whole and to bring the peace process to a conclusion, stating, in words recorded in the minutes, that they had agreed to make a very grave sacrifice. In this respect, the Maze debate shows that the founding cadres of the Republic correctly understood the maritime geopolitics of the Aegean and the Eastern Mediterranean. The problem was not a lack of strategic vision, but the absence of naval power capable of supporting that vision. Maze is one of the most striking examples demonstrating that the foundations of the geopolitical concept later termed the Blue Homeland were already visible at Lausanne, but that the country's lack of a navy prevented these objectives from being fully realized at the negotiating table. The Montreux Negotiations. The Montreux Conference, held from 23 June to 20 July 1936, proceeded through negotiations between the conflicting interests of the great powers and Turkey's quest for sovereignty. For Britain, the Straits were not merely a Turkish issue. Freedom of entry to and exit from the Black Sea was considered vital for maintaining naval supremacy in the Mediterranean and keeping Soviet Russia under control. Britain, therefore, did not want the Straits to be placed under the absolute control of a single state. The Soviets, by contrast, did not want the Straits to be fully open to foreign navies, while Britain defended the opposite position. The Straits regime established at Lausanne was a compromise between these two approaches. At the same time, after the First World War, the victorious powers regarded the placement of international waterways under international supervision as a means of preserving peace. Examples such as the Suez and Kiel canals reinforced this approach. The Straits Commission was a product of this understanding.
The changing balance in 1936. In 1936, Ataturk's Turkey faced a completely different situation. During the intervening 13 years, the international system had changed fundamentally. German rearmament, Italy's expansionist policies in the Mediterranean, and the approach of another world war made a revision of the Straits regime necessary. Turkey assessed this changing geopolitical environment with great diplomatic skill and regained full military sovereignty over the Straits without firing a single shot. An objective that could not be achieved on the battlefield in 1923 was realized at the negotiating table in 1936. In this process, Turkey did not merely benefit from changing international conditions, such as Italy's invasion of Abyssinia in 1935 and Japan's invasion of Manchuria in 1931. It also demonstrated that it now possessed a navy capable of defending the Straits, with Yavuz returned to service, new destroyers acquired from Italy, new submarines acquired from the Netherlands and Italy, and the establishment of the Geldgic naval base. During the Montreux negotiations, Turkey had a deterrent force consisting of 1 battlecruiser, 4 destroyers, and 5 submarines. The Straits, which had been entrusted to an international commission in 1923, could therefore be returned to Turkey's full sovereignty in 1936. In other words, while the victory at Lausanne rested on the great triumph achieved by land power, The victory at Montreux rested on an effective Republican navy built over 13 years, together with diplomatic strength. For this reason, the Montreux Convention regarding the regime of the Straits was the Republic's second great victory, completing the maritime link left unfinished at Lausanne.
In a message published in the newspaper Cumhuriyet immediately after the signing of Montreux, Ataturk said, "The work of the Montreux Conference, which is proof that intelligence, reason, and energy, when employed with reliance and confidence in the noble character of the nation, the unbreakable strength of its army, and the infallible common sense of civilized humanity, can produce the peaceful and reassuring results needed by all humankind, is truly a historic event worthy of joy and celebration." Another statement by Ataturk concerning the Straits and Lausanne after Montreux was recorded by his aide Javad Abbas Gurer in the 10th November 1941 issue of Cumhuriyet. Today is a day of celebration, a day of joy. Do you know why, dear citizens? Because Lausanne was crowned at Montreux. Lausanne is complete, and history will always teach its completeness. Yet there was one small matter that caused it pain and sorrow: the Straits. That matter was resolved at Montreux. If Turkish sensitivity is concerned with this, then it is certainly rejoicing. It rejoices, and it should rejoice. Montreux also had a major international impact. The newspaper Akşam, on 22 July 1936, reported the assessment published by Britain's Daily Telegraph on 21 July in the following words: "Turkey, once regarded as the sick man of Europe, has recovered from the moral illness attributed to it for 2 centuries, and Anatolia, which 20 years ago was partitioned among rival states, has become the strong man of today. The new convention has fully recognized this fact." The brotherhood of Lausanne and Montreux. Lausanne and Montreux are not two independent international instruments. They are two complementary phases of the same struggle for sovereignty. Lausanne recognized the independence and territorial sovereignty of Anatolia, while Montreux carried that sovereignty to the sea. Without one, the other remains incomplete.
Lausanne was the diplomatic recognition of the borders reached by the Turkish army's land campaign. Montreux extended that same sovereignty to the Straits and to maritime geopolitics by taking advantage of changing international conditions. It is therefore impossible to separate Lausanne from Montreux or Montreux from Lausanne. Lausanne is the founding document of sovereignty on land, while Montreux is the founding document of maritime sovereignty in the Straits. The geopolitical architecture of the Republic was built upon these two treaties. It is this brotherhood of Lausanne and Montreux that will endure forever. Law can protect sovereignty only when it is backed by political will, military power, and geopolitical awareness. In 1936, Turkey correctly read the changing international environment, combined diplomatic determination with its reborn naval strength, and regained, without war, the sovereignty over the Straits that it had been unable to obtain at Lausanne. The task today is to sustain the same strategic reasoning, to protect Montreux without concession, while once again placing the violated security provisions of Lausanne in the Aegean at the center of the national and international agenda. The preservation of Montreux is a prerequisite for peace in the Black Sea, while defense of the demilitarized status of the Aegean Islands is a prerequisite for the security of Anatolia from the sea. The effect of the Montreux regime on peace and Turkish security. The Montreux Convention regarding the regime of the Straits not only completed the unfinished aspect of the Treaty of Lausanne concerning the Straits regime, but also restored Turkey's full sovereignty over the Straits and delivered multi-dimensional strategic gains in regional and global maritime geopolitics. This change did not merely mean that the Dardanelles and the Bosphorus could be defended.
Montreux restored the security integrity of Thrace, the Sea of Marmara, and Anatolia, creating an uninterrupted strategic connection between Turkey's territories in Europe and Asia. The era in which foreign navies could force the Straits and place the capital under pressure from the sea, as they had during the final 2 centuries of the Ottoman Empire, came to an end. Turkey became a sovereign state capable of conducting the defense of the Straits entirely by its own will. In this respect, Montreux is not merely a convention governing passage, but a military and political instrument of sovereignty that directly safeguards Turkey's territorial integrity and state security. The 90 years that have passed have shown that the Montreux regime created, in a semi-enclosed sea such as the Black Sea, an enduring system of maritime security and arms control with few parallels anywhere in the world. While guaranteeing the free passage of merchant vessels, the convention established a sensitive and balanced security regime between littoral states and non-littoral naval powers by placing detailed restrictions on the class, tonnage, and number of warships, as well as the duration of their stay in the Black Sea. It thereby prevented states without a Black Sea coastline from establishing a permanent military presence. The Black Sea became neither a completely closed inland sea, nor, as in the Atlantic and Pacific, an arena in which carrier strike groups, major amphibious forces, and non-littoral navies could freely project power. Thanks to this balance, the Black Sea has remained largely free for nearly 90 years from the permanent accumulation of great power naval forces. Montreux has provided the legal foundation of regional stability, and Turkey has served as the principal guarantor of that order.
One of the most important strategic advantages Montreux provides to Turkey is that, in situations of war or an imminent threat of war, decision-making authority is left largely to the Turkish state. When Turkey is a belligerent, or when it considers itself threatened with imminent war, it has broad discretion to regulate the passage of warships through the straits. This authority constitutes a strong protective mechanism based on the principle of the sovereign state, ensuring that Turkey's security is not left to the will of other countries. The value of Montreux has been confirmed repeatedly not only by historical experience, but also through international crises. During the Second World War, restrictions on the passage of belligerent states' navies through the straits played a decisive role in keeping Turkey out of the war and preventing the Black Sea from becoming a major maritime front. Throughout the Cold War, although the Black Sea was one of the most sensitive contact zones between NATO and the Warsaw Pact, the restrictions imposed by Montreux prevented it from becoming the scene of a permanent naval buildup. The Soviet Union's post-1945 demands for bases and joint defense arrangements in the Straits also demonstrated how vital a security shield Montreux was for Turkey. The most important test of the Montreux regime in the 21st century has undoubtedly been the Russia-Ukraine war. Following the outbreak of the war, Turkey invoked Article 19 of the Montreux Convention and halted the passage of warships belonging to the belligerent states through the straits. Under this provision, as long as Turkey is not a party to the war, warships of belligerent states may not pass through the straits, with an exception only for vessels returning to their home bases in the Black Sea.
Ankar's impartial and uncompromising application of this provision prevented Russia from sending additional warships from its Baltic, Northern, and Pacific fleets into the Black Sea, while also preventing NATO countries from introducing new warships into the region. Montreux thus operated as a neutral security mechanism, limiting both sides within the same legal order, and prevented the Black Sea from becoming an arena of unlimited military competition among global naval powers. This application clearly demonstrated that even after 90 years, Montreux remains one of the most successful regional security regimes, capable of functioning effectively even in times of crisis. This historical experience also confirms the fundamental principle of Turkey's Black Sea policy. The security of the Black Sea should primarily be the shared responsibility of the littoral states. Turkey's state policy should be based on an approach that keeps the Black Sea away from unrestricted military competition among outside powers and emphasizes regional ownership and cooperation among coastal countries. Littoral-centered initiatives such as Operation Black Sea Harmony and Black Sea 4 have been successful examples of this approach, once again demonstrating that the fundamental principle should be that the Black Sea is protected by the states bordering it. The Treaty of Lausanne laid the foundation for Turkey's economic and political independence by abolishing the capitulations, while Montreux completed the Republic's maritime security architecture by restoring full sovereignty over the straits. In this respect, the two treaties are not alternatives to one another, but two great and complementary stages in the Republic's construction of sovereignty. Lausanne legitimized the military victory in Anatolia under international law, while Montreux completed the most critical missing link of sovereignty in maritime geopolitics.
Nevertheless, an important unresolved security issue persists in Turkey's maritime geopolitics. Sovereignty over the straits is today guaranteed by Montreux. A permanent security regime restricting outside naval powers in the Black Sea has been established, and the strategic integrity between Thrace and Anatolia has been strengthened. By contrast, the arming of the eastern Aegean islands immediately off the Anatolian coast with heavy weapons, their conversion into air and naval bases, and their use as forward military positions against Turkey, despite the demilitarized status prescribed for them by the Treaty of Lausanne, constitute one of the most important gaps in Turkey's security architecture. The status of the eastern Aegean islands, therefore, remains one of the 21st century's most significant strategic issues, not only under international law, but also in terms of Turkey's national security and maritime geopolitics. Conclusion: Lausanne and Montreux are not two independent diplomatic achievements, but two historic stages that complement one another in the Turkish state's struggle for sovereignty. Lausanne established the foundation of Turkey's political and economic independence by recognizing the national struggle's victory on land under international law. Montreux carried that independence into maritime geopolitics by restoring full sovereignty over the straits. Without one, the Republic's security on land would remain incomplete. Without the other, its security at sea would remain incomplete. The most important lesson of these two great historical achievements, however, is not merely an understanding of the past. The real lesson is that international law does not produce sovereignty by itself. Law becomes enduring only to the extent that it is backed by military power, economic capability, political will, and the geopolitical intelligence that directs them.
The maritime sovereignty constrained at Lausanne by the absence of a navy was recovered through diplomacy at Montreux, thanks to the Republican Navy rebuilt over the course of 13 years. The true architect of Montreux was therefore not successful diplomacy alone, but also the Turkish Navy reborn at Geljuk. Turkey faces the same task in the 21st century, to preserve Montreux without concession, to keep the Black Sea free from unrestricted military competition by outside powers on the basis of the principle of littoral responsibility, and to maintain national resolve against violations of Lausanne's security provisions concerning the eastern Aegean islands. These are the natural continuation of the same strategic outlook. Sovereignty at sea is not a right won once and protected forever, but an element of national power that every generation must recreate. History shows that states without sea power are left at a disadvantage at the negotiating table, while states possessing strong navies, sound economies, and strategic vision are able to shape international law in their own favor. Behind Lausanne stood the cavalry, artillery, and infantry of the Great Offensive. Behind Montreux stood the reborn Republican Navy. Turkey's ability to protect its rights and interests in the blue homeland in the future depends on the same reality.